Hello, welcome to my overgrown garden for what is going to be probably the last in the Vadi's Garden series. Apologies, this has been delayed. I've been ill, I've been on holiday, and I filmed a version of this that I wasn't happy with. In this video, right, this builds upon what we've been talking about in the previous Vadi's Gardens videos. You don't have to watch them for this to be useful, but it'll probably help. And I'm going to talk about a question that I get asked a lot, which is like, well, which guard is best? Which guard should I be in? Which is really not a very good way of thinking about this problem. And essentially, the problem we're going to talk about is how do you choose your guard, right? And what kind of considerations do you have for understanding when you should change guard, what guard position you should be in, sort of what's going on. I've talked a lot about Vadi's specific guards, and I want to move away from kind of Vadi specifics for this and talk way more generally about guard position. So this advice should really kind of apply almost regardless of what system you have in defense, and almost regardless of what weapon you have in defense actually as well. If you're looking for specific Vadi guard advice, you can go back to the ones that talk about Vadi specific guards. So the fundamental question we're asking here is, how do I stand, right? What position do I want to be in? And it sounds like it's a question that's just about what I do, but it's really not. And before we get into kind of the considerations of how we then decide this, we have to bring our opponent into the equation here. Because as I've described in previous videos, the main feature of guards is not as a position to hang around in, but as a position to set up an action or to finish an action, right? Or we're talking about the set up the action really mostly here. And in order to know what actions I want to set up, I need to know what I want to do and who I want to do it against. And that's going to be dependent on my opponent, their position, what they're doing, what they want to do, what they're good at, relative to what I'm good at. And then whatever tactical plan I've got to kind of defeat that opponent. So it's best not to, before I get into some specifics of that, it's best not to favor one guard over the others too much, because it might be great against 75% of opponents, but it might not match up to one particular opponent. And if you only use the same guard every single time, sooner or later you're going to fence somebody where that is a bad matchup. So the first thing we want to do with working out what guard we want to do is to look at what guard the opponent is. And there are really kind of three or four things that we need to consider, maybe five, when we're assessing the opponent's guard, right? And the first, the most obvious, and the clearest one is, what does it cover, right? What is physically open? So something like this, right? You're looking at me, I'm standing like this. Clearly, this is not open, right? In the position I happen to be in right now. Hands, probably yes, right? Obviously, everything on this side is perfectly open. Legs, perfectly open, right? Versus here, right? Well, now everything at waist up is kind of open. Here is kind of closed. Related to this is also how easy it is for me to defend particular targets, right? That's kind of the next thing. But whatever guard or position I'm in, some things will be open, some things won't, right? It's important that you look at the very specific position they're in, not kind of a general perception of a guard, right? We might say, lady, great, lady closes this line of attack. If I hold it well, it does. If I'm in a slightly different position, or if I'm kind of coming in, I do occasionally see people they think they're a lady and they're kind of holding it like this, right? Actually, right now, I'm not really covering anything, right? And, using that, you can understand these kind of sneaky openings where they think they're covered, but they're not. Those are great places to attack in general, right? So that's one aspect of the opponent's guard. Related, or sort of following on from that, is what is it that they can easily do from it, right? And that's both defensive and offensive, right? So I'm going to pick lady again, just because it's a nice, simple example, right? Okay, clearly, as we've seen in previous videos, my most obvious things I can do are kind of cuts to the side, right? We've seen that, and also obviously kind of easy defenses to this side, right? So with lady, here I'm covered, here I'm easy to defend. That's going to affect how we choose to approach that, right? Less easy for me to defend perhaps my legs, right? So that's something we're going to be considering. Less easy perhaps to defend my hands, right? Again, something worth considering. Less obvious for that particular one is that it's not very good against defending against thrusts. So that, again, that's kind of a consideration, what it can do, what it can do well, and what it can do badly. Something like here, right? Okay, covering less. All those defensive actions are probably harder. If anything, the legs especially are harder versus here, right? Maybe I'm a bit more open at top, but I'm much less open at the bottom. My hands, right, much less open, defending the hands much better. So we're able to look at them and we'll say, this is covered, this is an easy defense, this is a hard defense. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to attack the hard option, but that is information you need to have to decide what to do. Related, right, is, so what can they do from it? Is attacking as well, right? Not just defending. So here, like I'm very obviously charging a thrust. That is my obvious move. Less obviously charging a thrust, but I can still do it. And understanding both what is the easiest thing for them to do and what are the possible things for them to do are kind of important considerations, right? If I am here, right, the visitor, if I'm here, right, I can charge this, but that is kind of more logical. We also know things like thrusts, etc., are coming good from a low guard, right? So far we've got what's covered, what can they defend easily, what can they defend more difficultly, what can attack easily, what can attack more difficultly, right? Last one is movement. And I don't actually need to solve for this one, kind of leg position, right? My right leg is forward. It's easier for me to do it that way, right? Some sword systems will call this is the tool on my front foot, this side being my outside. So this would be my outside if my left leg is forward, this side is my outside. My right leg is forward, it's easier to move to your inside, right? Likewise then, if I want to come to a position that's hard for them, moving to their outside, right, is a good position because it's harder for them to move to their outside without kind of stepping forward, stepping around, and this kind of stuff, especially kind of a fast movement. So that's the last one. Where can they easily move? Again, you're always easy moving to your inside. Getting to someone's outside is an advantageous position to be in because it's harder for them to move that way. Also harder for them to kind of come around the outside for a defense. It's easier to defend on your inside, right? So that's their guard. Now, it's a lot of information to consider, especially because they might not be standing there, but I'll come back to that. What do you do with it, right? And all of this now gets very complicated to answer in general. So the short version is it depends, right? What do I want to do with this information? And that might also depend not just on what they can do in principle, but if you've read your opponent well or you know them well, that might also affect your decisions here, right? So I'll go for a very common one. A lot of Lichtenauer offenses will always start like this, and they will always do an opening with a step, right? Oberhau in German, strong downward cut, strong hand, strong side downward cut, right? If I know that, as well as the position that they're in, that whenever they're here, that's what they want to do, again, I can use that information to plan what guard I should be in. A couple options though, right? And all those things we use to assess the opponent's guard, we assess our own guard with them as well. Couple options, right? So they're coming in here. Option one, don't let them do it. These kind of guards, right? Something, just shove your sword in the way. You have seen my ability on advantage. Advantage is the concept we use for this. Essentially, I pre-block what they want to do, right? Depending on my opponent, that may be good or bad, right? I had this at Wolf Call recently. I had an opponent who really had never seen this before, right? I did this, and he really struggled. He wasn't sure what to do. You could see I could read in his body language. He was visibly confused when I did this in front of his Vomtag, and I exploited that for the rest of the match, right? Because I'm blocking the thing he wants to do, and he didn't really have a backup plan. I have some friends, some opponents, and some, both, that don't care, right? They're very good at, they're here, right? Yes, maybe that's their plan A, but they're very good at saying, fine, I'm going to go there instead. Or I'm going to go there instead, right? And this is the downside of blocking their most obvious attack it forces them, well, either to do something stupid, which is great if they want to, but it forces them, if they want to attack you safely, to do something less obvious and thus harder to defend, right? So then maybe they're going to go for your hands or your legs or something like that, right? Or attack to a different angle. So maybe actually what I want to do is encourage that, right? Again, we're talking about a person who's standing in their guard, charging this. Maybe actually I want to encourage them to come in. Mate, I'm nice and open. You can hit me. It's fine. It's cool. It's cool. It's cool. I've defended. I'm going to come back in, right? So do we want to give them an opening, an obvious opening to take because we know they're going to take it, or do we want to close their opening down? Depends, right? But your guard choice can determine that, right? I can choose a guard to block it if I want to block it. I can choose a guard that allows it if I want to allow it, and deal with it in terms of whatever it happens to be. Again, if you're going to allow it, you want to choose a guard that's quite easy to defend against it, right? That you can defend against it easily. This is obvious, right? I talked about the rising beat parry. If you're good at it, you might want to do this. Although people are quite reluctant to attack over a sword there because they don't have a good angle covering it. But you could do it, right? Again, it depends on your opponent. I probably don't want to do this, right? This is kind of, it allows it. It's a bit of a weird one because this is sort of discouraging it because there's a sword there. It's also quite bad for parrying it, right? So these are the sorts of considerations you're going to bring into effect. You have a similar consideration, of course, with your own strikes, right? You might not want to be allowing them to do it. Again, we can talk about that guard just because it's easy to. But I also need to set up something where if I want to attack, I can, right? I talked about this one, and actually I had a conversation with my opponent, Wolf Cole, after the fact. And he was like, well, what can you do from there? You can't do anything. I was like, well, no, I can. I can attack here. I can attack here. I can actually attack there if I want to. I can stab you if I want to, right? I know what I can do from that guard. I know I have options to attack them. They might not know that. Great. And that might not be true of you, right? You might think, looking at me doing this, thinking, that's fucking weird. I like it. It works well. But if you can't do that, that's not an option for you. You might want to consider some other guard. So if you don't want to attack, because you might look at this and think, well, my only attack option is there. But that's where his sword is. That's a bad attacking plan, right? So if that is the only thing you can do from that guard, you don't want to be in that guard against somebody, you know, who's in here, right? Because you only get your only attacking option is a bad plan. So that's kind of possible attacks. And there's also obvious attacks, right? Do I want them to defend or do I not want them to defend is a valid consideration, or is it my plan A, right? Obviously, if they don't defend something, you'll take it. But if I want them to be worried about a thrust, I might hang out in a point forward guard because I want them to be worried about the thrust and be flinchy so that if I'm feinting, right, that I want them to be like, there's a thrust coming in, but that was a feint, right? Vadi talks about this guard as having malice in its reign. I think that's kind of what he's talking about. It's kind of prompting this feint. He also talks about thrusts as making the guards waver. Again, kind of consideration. If I don't want them to be expecting a thrust and I want to thrust them, though, I might be a more attracted guard. I might be thinking, okay, this isn't, I'm not thrusting you. I'm not thrusting you. I'm not thrusting you. Oh, I am, right? And again, it's all about what am I setting up? So hopefully this is something you can apply. So do I want them, am I going to do an obvious strike? And do I want them to act on the back of that obvious strike, right? And that could also be, I want to do a thrust. I want them to actually defend against it. And I want to use that to set up some kind of follow-up. You know, that's also an option too. Similarly, right, if they're a person who's not very good at adopting guards and they're commonly kind of getting gaps in their guard, you might want to take guards where you can do lots of quick strikes to various targets, like low guards are great for that, right? So as soon as there's a gap, you can take it and run away, right? It's all about this kind of relative, what you want to do against the opponent. But then the other thing between all of this, right? So far we've talked about two people roughly being static, right? They've adopted a guard, I've chosen some guard for whatever purposes I want to do. But that's not really how it works, right? You're not generally sort of standing around. You don't generally go, now choose, right? And I'll come back to that. So the other kind of consideration is how do we affect their expectations? Either, you know, we've talked about this already, expecting the thrust, but also making them not expect certain things and or misjudge the situation. Measure is the main one for that, right? I talked about in previous videos, particularly middle guards, right? playing with guard changes as we move to affect someone's measure. If I want someone to back the fuck away, in general, I'm going to use nice threatening guards, right? Something where they're like, okay, no, something's coming in. If I want to draw them in, I'm going to use nice unthreatening guards, right? It will work against some people, it won't work against others, especially people who are watching this might expect it. And I find if people are expecting it, they tend to go the opposite and sort of overcompensate, as it were, for the difference. And I might be changing it, right? I might be starting here, like, okay, I want to draw him in. I'm going to go backwards, become the low guard, and I've drawn him in, and he's bad at his position, and I've kind of come there. We're generally not going to be staying in one guard, right? As we're moving around, we're going to be changing, we're going to be trying things out. That guard change might just be a feint, right? What's going to happen? Is he going to react when I put that in? No, he's not. Fine, I'm going to now it's going to be a real one, probably faster than that. And in general, these guard changes, when paired with footwork, right? That's important. Can be used to confuse measure and confuse the opponent by making it difficult for them to understand what your actual plan is. And that last point is really important because, I've talked about these considerations, all these things about what position they're in, what do they want to do, what's open, all this kind of stuff. What am I doing? All these kind of things. And 5 or 6 different points to set a position, both of your positions and the measure between you. So about 15 things to consider when they might only be in the guard for that long. Right? And you got to consider it pretty quickly. So changing guard can stop if you hang out in a guard. More actually, if you hang out in a guard too much, you're giving your opponent a lot of time to sort of be like, okay, that's what they're going to do. Here's what I got. I can do this. Cool. Bam. So you don't want to stay too long in a single guard. At the same time, and when I talk about tempo, I'll talk about this more. Changing guard is also a vulnerability, right? If I'm too close and I'm changing guard in this moment, well, if I'm changing guard in the moment I'm changing guard, I'm vulnerable because I'm not yet in a ready position, right? So changing too much, changing in the wrong way is a downside, is a negative, and could cause you issues. So you've got to have this balance between not being too static and not being too dynamic, right? Not moving too much. So change guards with purpose, right? Don't just be like, I'm going to change guard. Oh, I've been hit. I had this in Dust Lions Cup a few years back. I had an opponent who kept doing this. He did it a lot. And after a few iterations, I was like, okay, cool, that's a perfect window to attack. Thank you for showing it to me. Because he had no real reason to change guard. He was just changing guard. There was no threat to it. So, yeah, you can definitely move too much. So, all in all, wrap all that up. Understanding what guard you should be in is hard, okay? You don't want to hang around too much in a guard. The longer you're in a guard, and even if you're only using kind of fairly similar guards, right? The longer you're in that position, the longer your opponent has to work out what to do against it, and the easier it is for them to do it. But bringing all this together was very complicated. In all cases, we're trying to make the opponent think we want to do something. That might be we want to make them think that we're going to do the thing that we are going to do, because then they have a predictable response and we deal with it. Or we might want to make them think we're going to do one thing and do something else, right? It's not necessarily going to be the same every single time. Likewise, we might want to prevent them from doing the obvious things that they're going to do. Great. If we do, and they've only got one trick, fantastic. If we do and they've got lots of different tricks, then now we're going to do something weird and unexpected, and it's going to be harder for us to deal with. So we've got to worry about that too. And in general, we are trying to make sure that we are at least aware of what is covered and what is not at all times. The last thing I'll say before I finish this off on guards is that the biggest thing to be worried about when you're worrying about your guard position is, are you actually covered where you think you're covered? Most of the time when people get sniped to the hand or something like that, it's because A, they're not as covered as they think they are, and B, they've messed up their measure, right? They're too close. It can be quite subtle. Great. Okay. Shit. Right? I just moved 4 centimeters. And if I'm also moving around, right, and my opponent's moving around, and all this kind of stuff, it's quite easy to misjudge 4 centimeters. So that is something to watch out for as you're doing this. But in all of this, remember, it's not about picking a guard and staying there. It's about guards setting up what you want to do, and what you want to do is dependent on your opponent, their position, and who they are, what they're good at, as well as what you're good at. Thanks for watching. As I say, this is probably my last video on guards. I am going to move on and do some videos on tempo next, which follows nicely from what we've been talking about today and in general with the guards. Thanks for watching.